Okay, welcome back everyone. Thank you for making it through to the last session of the day. We're acutely conscious of the fact that this is the only session that's keeping you away from a glass of wine or a glass of champagne. So Noreena's just suggested that we'll have a bottle of champagne for the best question. I'm not quite sure who's going to judge it. Perhaps we'll judge that one between us. So on your mettle, start thinking up your questions now. There's a bottle of champagne in it for you. So we have with us Noreena Hertz, author, broadcaster, professor, and megahertz, apparently. It's a good name. I think if you're going to be called anything, why not call yourself megahertz? And Noreena is going to help us see through the eyes of the saver, and in particular, the next generation of savers. And I'm looking forward to finding out why they're called Generation K. Well, without further ado, Noreena.
Thank you. Hands up, anyone in this room who's got a child aged between 15 and 24? Oh my gosh, so many of you. Well, this isn't actually going to be a session on parenting. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But why I am going to talk about this generation today, and as a particularly challenging adult myself, that's me age 16, that's why this isn't going to be a session on parenting. But why I am going to focus on this generation today is for three reasons. The first is because within the next 3 years, this generation will make up a third of the workforce. Second, because this is going to be the first generation who will spend their entire working lives with a pension. And third, because when it comes to what they value, how they think about money, how it is they think about their futures, Generation K is very different to other generations, including the millennials, who you probably already have been thinking about. So what I want to do today is to help you to understand this generation. And I want to share with you insights from 4.5 years of studying, researching this generation, interviewing them, doing surveys, conducting focus groups, one-on-one interviews, really trying to drill into who they are, and also share insights from the advisory work I do with some big corporations, helping them engage this generation and also future-proof their business. So what do we know about this generation that I call Generation K? Well, first, we know that they're fundamentally shaped by technology. Permanently on, super social, multitasking, multi-screening. This generation doesn't even remember an era pre-digital. They really are the first true smartphone generation, and they spend a whopping 8 hours a day on social media and online. They shop, they socialize, they get jobs, they find dates, they pay bills, all with the swipe of their phone. But technology isn't the only force that has shaped them. They've been shaped, I believe, fundamentally by two other forces. By the worst recession that the West faced in decades. This is the generation that grew up in the shadow of economic decline, job insecurity, and a lack of financial optimism. They came of age during the 2008 financial crisis. They witnessed family members or friends of families having to tighten their belts, maybe lose their homes, jobs. Unlike the millennials, who entered the workforce with a, let's say, entitled attitude, this generation understands the precariousness of success, the need to work hard. They've also been shaped by another force, by the world of existential threat that they are experiencing, by the Manchester and London terror attacks, by the Bataclan horrors and the Barcelona attacks, by the rise of ISIS and then, of course, of Al-Qaeda and now, of course, ISIS. This is the generation that has had terrorism, brutality, and danger piped into their smartphones 24/7. It's not that the world is objectively more dangerous today and many of us in this room, we grew up with a sense of danger, for those of us who grew up in the 70s, for example. But for this generation, they're experiencing danger differently, constantly, repeatedly on their phones. And it's this combination of three forces: technology, downturn, and danger, which is why I call this generation Generation K, because K is after Katniss Everdeen, who is the heroine of the global franchise The Hunger Games. Because unlike for the older millennials, for whom the world was their oyster, for this generation, the world is less oyster, more Hobbesian nightmare. Unequal, dystopian, harsh, and we see this playing out in a number of ways. First, this 60%, that's the percentage of adults our age who trust big corporations to do the right thing. What percentage of this generation do you think trusts big corporations to do the right thing? 15? 10? You got it. 6%. The social contract between this generation and big corporations is broken, but it's not irrevocable, and how to regain and retain their trust is something I want to come back to. Second, you may think of them as the selfie generation, but they're actually not selfish. This generation volunteers, campaigns, reaches into their own pockets to give to charity more than previous generations. They care passionately about climate change, about the state of the world. They care massively about equality, economic, racial, social, gender. This generation cares really deeply about social, economic, and environmental justice. They want the world to be a better place, and they want to play a part in doing that. Third characteristic of this generation: they are profoundly anxious, not just about boyfriends, girlfriends, college, the kind of things you would expect this generation to be worried about. They're really worried about how their own futures will pan out, especially in economic and financial terms. I cannot overstate how worried this generation is about their own economic future, security and stability. They firmly believe that they will be worse off than their parents, and that there won't be any welfare state to step in to help them when they're old or if they're sick. They believe that if they don't look after themselves financially, and these are images from a focus group that when I asked them to draw about their economic futures, they believe that if they don't look after themselves financially, no one else will. And yet they feel that their own ability to do so is very slim, and this is creating huge anxiety. 72% of this generation worry about debt. 72%, and we're talking 15 to 24-year-olds, and not just student loans. They're worried about getting into debt, it turns out, period. Again, when I asked them to draw kind of what debt meant to them, these were some of the images. You can see they really felt it viscerally. This generation is resigned to a future of endless borrowing, and it worries them inordinately, especially as my research suggests that this generation isn't anything like the irresponsible teenager of yore. Indeed, the fourth trait of this generation is that this is a generation that is financially cautious, desperately trying to be prudent. It's a generation of savers. Whether it's the teenage girl saving her babysitting money, or the boy working at Top Man at weekends, in focus groups that I've conducted, every single participant said that they consciously saved money, and not just, this was really interesting, not just for short-term experiences, not just, say, to go to a concert in 2 months' time, but for later on in life, for, as one of them said to me, for when I'm a fully fledged adult. It seems that whilst they recognize that saving can be painful, they seem to be willing to accept short-term pain for longer-term gain. Like the silent generation who grew up during the Great Depression, this generation is sensible and risk-averse, not only when it comes to their future financial situation. In fact, they drink less, they take less drugs, they have less sex than previous generations. And history teaches us that these traits are likely to persist throughout their lives. In fact, this generation is cautious and considered when it comes to making decisions, period. Overwhelmed by information, cognizant of and worried about fake news. This generation reaches out more than any other generation to people they trust when it comes to making decisions. Whether it's TripAdvisor or Yelp or Amazon, or a post they've shared on Facebook, whether it's their parents' steers or that of their friends, whether it's an unboxing video that they're watching. The fifth trait of this generation that I wanted to share is that for Generation K, others' experience is their evidence. Your experience is their evidence. Your experience is one of the key factors that makes them decide to buy something. In fact, 70% of this generation say that they're likely to make a purchase based on a friend's social media post. That's double the percent of our generation who would say that we would do that. The sixth insight is that Generation K are not only passive consumers, but they increasingly put premium on things that they can co-create. Does anyone know who Hatsune Miku is? Yes, there is somebody. Okay, great. I didn't. I was like all the rest of you. I didn't know who she was before I went to Japan. But when I was in Japan, I found out. She's actually one of Japan's most successful pop stars. She's an artist who fills stadiums. She's actually playing at Olympia in December. And I just wanted to share with you a clip of a concert of her in full flow. Well, I mean, she's astonishing on a couple of counts. First, she's a hologram. She's not a person, so that's pretty weird. But the reason why I wanted to highlight her is because she's the world's first co-created pop star. Her fans choose her outfits. They choose her hairstyle. They even write her songs. Co-created, co-designed. This manga-esque star doesn't just speak to her fan base. She's literally part of them. Because this is a generation, really important to understand this about them. This is a generation of makers, creators, inventors, whether it's the teenager learning to code or the 20-year-old who wants a sewing machine for Christmas so that she can make her own presents, or the 24-year-old who's a pro at editing videos. Generation K doesn't only want to consume, they want to become part of the design and creation process. They want to put their own stamp on products and services, their own stamp. Because for Generation K, expressing their own distinct preferences is the norm. And it helps explain why, when in open-ended surveys I've asked this generation to describe themselves, unique is the word that they most commonly use. As Sarah said to me, it's about expressing myself as I truly am. Anxious, distrustful. Socially minded, prudent. Wanting advice, yet wanting agency and the ability to use their own voice. These are some of the key defining traits of this generation. So what does this mean? What does this mean to you in this room as leaders in the pensions sector? I want to just go through 4 very broad brushstroke suggestions. Obviously, when I work with companies, we can go much more granular, but just 4 suggestions just to get you thinking about how in practical terms this might, an understanding of this generation might help you better engage them. So first, if you want to engage this generation, you need to help them invest into companies, technologies, products that reflect how it is that they care about the state of the world. We don't obviously know much about Generation K's investment behavior yet because of their age. But what we know about their consumer behavior is that they're even more committed to social and environmental values than millennials. And given that millennials are 2 times more likely than the overall investor population to invest in socially or environmentally responsible companies, I think it's pretty clear that Generation K will be the most socially and environmentally driven investors we've seen so far. So how can you curate your pension offerings to speak to their social, environmental, and ethical issues that they care about so much? How can you provide transparency about investment decisions made on their behalf that this generation, which has grown up checking reviews on Amazon, searching online, is obviously going to demand of their investments too? So something to think about, care. The second thing to think about, in a world of fake news, information overload, distrust of big corporations, how can you help them curate the information landscape so that they get the financial advice and security that they need, crave, and are entitled to? I want to share with you a great example from a very different sector. Unilever wanted to figure out how to help this generation look after something very important to them, their hair. And what they did was they set up a YouTube channel, All Things Hair. And they were very smart about who presented the content to them. They knew that it had to be people this generation trusted. So they got video bloggers, vloggers, people like Zoella, and also some upcoming video bloggers to do the presenting for them. And even though they used Unilever products, there was never an overt Unilever sell. Many of these videos got over 1 million views. I think there is a question of how can you deploy in a similar fashion people this generation trusts to help them navigate their financial futures. The trusted curator role is up for grabs, and I think if one's smart, one can work out how to take it. Third, this generation has grown up in a world in which they can easily customize everything, from their sneakers to, as we saw, their pop stars. Unique is how they self-identify. So I think there's a question also to you. How can you personalize your offering so that they are able to somehow put their own unique stamp on it? Starbucks, again, in another sector, is a company doing this really well. Did you know that you could go into a Starbucks and order a mojito refresher? Non-alcoholic, of course. I didn't, but it turns out that teenagers do. They're going crazy for Starbucks' secret menu, where basically they can come up with any concoction they can imagine, go to a poor Starbucks barista and ask him to create it. That's one of their favorite current tipples, cotton candy frappuccino. And then they share photos of these drinks on Instagram, and there's a whole kind of social life then of these drinks. From Starbucks' point of view, it's absolute genius. Their fastest growing segment now are teenagers, a group who don't even drink coffee. I mean, absolute genius. But why I wanted to highlight that is because Starbucks has actually really effectively tapped into this generation's desire to personalize. How can you help them do this with their pensions? I know that there are a number of apps launching which are aiming to get this generation to do just that, well, when it comes to investing. One that I was reading about, Griffin, uses machine learning, artificial intelligence, to create customized stock portfolios based on the individual's unique preferences and interests. And looking at what's going on in fintech, there are some exciting things going on. And I think it is clear that there is going to be a demand for more personalized investments by this group. It's a question of how can you do that? Is this something you can do yourselves? Is this something you need to partner with someone with? Is this in-house? Is this buy or build? But how can you use these sorts of technologies to help them personalize? And finally, how can you make sure that you are speaking their language, their vernacular, that you're on their platforms? In part, it's about thinking about the medium through which you reach them, YouTube, or of course their phones. And again, there are some interesting lessons, I think, to be learned from some of the new fintech companies in the savings space in particular. Some of you may already be familiar with Moneybox. It's a cool app. It basically rounds up the purchases on your debit card to the nearest pound and invests the difference, in this case, into an ISA. So let's say you spend £3.40 on lunch, it would round it up to £4, and it would put the 60p difference into the ISA. There's a Singaporean fintech startup that's launching later this month that is making it, which is taking this sort of idea, but making it, I think, even more fun. With that, the participant can set their own savings rules. So, for example, you can set that you will automatically save £5 every time you use public transport rather than an Uber. Or you'll save £10 every time you exceed a time limit scrolling on your Instagram feed. So they're finding kind of a fun way to get people to save. And they're also giving rewards for hitting financial savings goals. I think just one thought, if you are going the app route, you need to make this user-friendly, because for this generation, their whole technological experience has to be frictionless. It's what they're used to, and anything less is really, to them, deemed unacceptable. But you might also want to think about, is there a way that you can gamify saving? Because I think for a generation reared on Call of Duty, Fortnite, Pokemon Go, this makes sense. And I just want to leave you with just one thought in this regard. There's been some really compelling academic research on how people, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, on how people save more if they see aged photographs of themselves. Because a real reason people don't save is because we simply can't imagine ourselves older. And might providing this generation, who've grown up on Snapchat filters and are used to seeing distortions of their face, might giving them aged photos of themselves at the point of purchase, or even aged virtual reality versions of themselves, help them save more. I mean, something I think interesting to think about. Care, curate. Customize, communicate. How to better engage this generation. Well, I look forward to us taking questions from you after this session. Of course, feel free to connect with me afterwards. I'd love to help you think through this in more depth. Because if we are to engage this generation, we need to understand them. If we are to connect with them, we need to better include them. If we are to future-proof our businesses, we need to evolve and adapt alongside them. We all do. Thank you.
Wow, I mean, that was a very powerful close, brilliant close. Thank you very much for that. Your description of that age group, I think, spot on. So I've got children aged from 16 to 22, right in your generation. So, that was a perfect description. But before we move on from it, you're asking us to make some big decisions around what we should do to our business models, what we should do to our businesses and our propositions. Just talk to me a little bit about the evidence base, the research process that you've gone through. Show us how robust that process was.
So in actually getting to know the generation?
Yeah.
Oh, so I've surveyed a number of thousand of them, primarily in the UK and US. I've done hundreds of interviews, focus groups, one-on-one interviews and focus groups where they do drawings, as you've seen as well as, of course, staying on top of all this secondary literature that's out there as well. So for about the past 4.5 years, I've been really immersed in them. And then also worked with some companies who are trying to better engage them in finance, but also in kind of consumer goods as well. So because there was a lot of attention on the millennials. And then I think the assumption was that the generation after the millennials would be just like the millennials, but actually they're really different. And I think understanding that, however painful it is to have a whole different segment, is actually really important.
Well, you started off, you were quite depressing me at the beginning, but I think you lifted it around. I think there's some materials that we can work with. So good research base.
Yeah, but also from your industry's perspective, the fact that they are worried about their economic futures actually hopefully means that they will take their economic future more seriously now and save more now and be able to think about their pensions earlier compared to previous generations.
And more economically sensible and prudent.
Yes.
I think that's
I was surprised by that finding, yeah.
Well, the living with debt bit, how much of that relates to university debt and educational debt?
So that was, so I initially got that data from the 72% from surveys, but then in focus groups I wanted to drill down on it more because I thought maybe it's all about student debt, but that's what really surprised me. They were really worried about the thought of ever getting a mortgage. I think it's because they were shaped so much by the 2008 downturn. They probably heard their parents talking about things or maybe saw somebody losing their home, and so they've been influenced by what they saw and heard.
Pretty depressing world for them to have been brought up in, I guess. It's all our fault. Okay, so we've got some really good questions have come in on the app, so I'm going to turn to those in a moment. But has anybody out there got some questions? Anybody want to have the first question? So there's one over there, so we'll start with that one over there. Is there any other hands up? Okay, then we'll go on to the one on the app afterwards, and then if anybody else has got another question, keep your hands or raise your hands in a moment. There's another one over there.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Dirk Bacon from Saul Trustee. Really interested in the points you raised about trust, your 60% of our generation versus 6% of theirs. And you moved on to talk about using people that they do trust, so the celebrities and vloggers. Do you believe there's any other avenue that we could take to build their trust? And do you think that their trust in, let's say, experts or more experienced people other than celebrities might grow as they move up the age range?
Well, interestingly, it's not celebrities per se, because if you look at, and it's worth actually looking at some of these YouTube stars who they love, like people like PewDiePie or Daniel Middleton. It's worth just going on and looking at them, because they're not like the kind of people we would have thought of as celebrities. They're not all glamorous, and they just look like regular kind of people. They look like them. They look like the kind of people they would hang out with, and I think there's a real distinction actually there, that the people they trust are, obviously they're not like them, and they have tens of millions of followers and are making lots of money from their YouTube personas, but there's something about the kind of people they trust who they don't know, that they feel that they're authentic. So there's something about the authenticity that really speaks to them, which is why companies that they believe are authentic, I think particularly appeal and resonate with them as well. So I think one thing is thinking about, understanding better when it comes to, for example, savings, who would be their trusted curators in that space. Because when I did some work for a very different, for a drinks manufacturer, and we asked that question, we found out that it was actually the kind of local baristas in the bar who they trusted. So I think it's about thinking, well, who are the trusted people in that space for them, and then working out how you engage that group. But I think it is this, they want to feel that it's experiential. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There was another question behind you. While the microphone travels over there, let me ask you one that's come in on the app. A question, I think it's a really good question, around how do this generation feel about collectivization, mutualization, about socialization of saving and other things?
It's a good question. I don't know. I haven't seen any data on it. They definitely, I mean, ideologically, what we know is that they have a problem with capitalism. In the United States, there was a very big study done by Harvard University in 2016, and 51% of 18 to 29-year-old Americans said that they didn't support capitalism, 51%. So, but again, it's something that needs drilling down into what exactly do they mean by that. You know, is it that they want state industry privatized? Probably not. I think it's to do with the fact that they feel that the world is unfair, that it hasn't delivered and isn't delivering. In fact, in my research, one of the things I found, which was really depressing, was that not one participant, it was in some focus groups I did, not one believed that in the idea that social mobility was a real possibility. They all believed that it was who you know, not just your own achievements. So I don't know what they would think about that. That would be something you'd have to do, I think, research on. But looking at how they think more generally about the world, it might appeal to them.
What could be interesting is the contrast between that and the 6% that you quoted, where only 6% of them trusted the institutions.
Yeah, big corporations.
Yeah, well, why do you think they've lost that trust?
I think because, well, I think social media plays a role there. So, you know, things that tend to be shared tend to be the worst stories about big companies. So, you know, they will have kind of little bits of snippets of information about companies. You know, they all knew that Amazon and Starbucks don't pay enough tax. They know about things like sweatshop labor. They know about fossil fuels. So I think it's things that get shared.
Right.
And the bad news gets shared quicker and faster.
So it's interesting, they'll socialise the negative experience. It will be interesting to see whether they'll socialise the positive potential benefits in due course.
Well, all the research shows from, all the research on how people share on social media shows that much higher percentage of bad news gets shared. Yeah. So it's hard to get good news stories to go viral.
Yeah. So let's go to that question over there. Can't hear you. We'll lip read.
The question was going to be about voting.
Oh, yeah.
And how this generation approaches voting.
Thank you. The politicians will listen to who votes,
Yes.
and traditionally older people vote more than younger people,
Yeah.
and that manifests its way in the way that government helps society. The government spends less than £10 billion a year on social housing, arguably for the young, more than £100 billion a year on the state pension, obviously for the old. Is this generation so distrusting that it's just not going to even bother to engage with the democratic process?
I think this generation will engage, but they might engage with, I think they're more likely to engage with more extreme politicians. So, for example, we saw here how successful Jeremy Corbyn was amongst the young demographic compared to the Conservatives at the last election. And actually, I've been looking at the rise of populism in Europe. And when I initially thought about populism, I thought it was probably overwhelmingly an older person's type of politics. But actually what I have found, to my surprise, is that a third of the youth vote in pretty much every country which has had a populist upswing, which is pretty much every European country, has gone to populists of both the right and the left, interestingly. And if you look at some of the rhetoric coming out of the populist leaders, they are trying to make sure that they are connecting with this generation and talking about issues that they care about. So I think it's not that they won't engage. I think they will engage if they think that a politician is speaking to them. That can be dangerous as well as good. Yeah.
So I think I saw, there's a hand down here. It's John down here, or the microphone's over there. Okay, we'll come to you in a moment, John.
By using a trusted persona to actually pass your message and push, or maybe the drinks company that you were mentioning's message, isn't that a breach of trust? Is it morally wrong? Because it's not their views that you're actually discussing. You're talking about your views or the drinks company's views or the whichever company is actually doing this, which to me just feels totally...
Inauthentic.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I think now on YouTube, for example, I think responsible companies are making sure that it's clear if it's paid content, even amongst one of their people. And it's actually something that people in that YouTube influencer, some people in that world are saying that from their perspective, if you're earning your money as an influencer, they realize that there's a potential problem with highlighting a product if they don't really believe in it. So I think, I think this is about making sure that there is an actual authentic fit if you are using any sort of spokesperson. And the responsibility is probably really on the company in question to do the due diligence to make sure that there is some authenticity there.
And that was one of the questions actually on the app was, are we a bit remote from them as a consumer, as an industry, or are we a bit remote? So do we need a persona that they can engage with?
Well, I think there are different ways to engage. I think that's one possibility. But it may not be someone young. I haven't done the research, so I don't know who they are, but it may be that it's their grandparents who, when it comes to financial planning, they really trust. And it may be that actually you need to get kind of grannies conversing around this with them. I don't know, but I think the thing is thinking about who do they trust, and then to your point, making this authentic. If somebody's saying, I wish I'd saved more and now I'm finding life tough and I wish that I'd put money aside and it was a true story, well, that's powerful and I think that's great. If it's somebody who's never saved a penny in their lives going, yay, yay, save, well, that isn't authentic. So I think it's about being authentic.
Okay.
When I was saying about the drinks, it was baristas who actually were using drinks every day. It was their actual drinks that they liked and used. The company then was finding the ones who were organic advocates.
So we're just about out of time, but John, so very quickly.
Okay, very quick.
Is that on?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Right.
And then we can repeat it to the room.
Okay. You said that experience equals evidence.
Yeah,
You said that
your experience is their evidence.
Our experience equals evidence, and that's
For
something
them.
that to them is believable. My generation and my parents' generation experienced uber left-wing, uber right-wing, lived through it, whether it's the Holocaust or whether it's socialism in the UK in the 70s. When you talk about that to the K generation, would they not say, fake news?
Oh, if you talk about big issues of the past. No, I mean, I think they understand that they're living in this fake news environment, and that worries them, and they're trying to figure out how to navigate it, and they do want help. So again, if a trusted persona tells them the story, maybe it's a teacher or maybe it's a parent, then they're likely to believe it. It's when they're trying to figure all the stuff out themselves, they actually know that they need help. But it's a challenging time to be growing up. I mean, it's quite incredible that we're living in an age when some of these horrific moments that you've referred to are even being questioned. But I don't think we need to feel so gloomy as to think that this whole generation will dismiss them, because they're not so binary.
So, unbelievably, we are out of time. That passed like a flash. That was absolutely brilliant. We had loads of questions in on the app that we didn't get to, so sorry if you asked a question and we didn't get the chance to do so. So I said I have children in that age range, and as you began speaking, I felt quite depressed. I could recognise some of those traits in them, but I also felt quite uplifted at the end that there are some things that we can work with. But you have very firmly thrown down the gauntlet. We need to think differently. We need to see through their eyes and understand their perspective when we start to deliver what we try to deliver to them. So thank you very much for doing that. In a moment, I'll ask you to say thank you to Noreena. But do please, before you go, rate the session on your conference app. And don't forget that we've got the networking drinks in a moment, and down there you'll find a cotton candy frappuccino for everybody. I'm assured it's delicious. I'm really looking forward to mine. But thank you very much, Noreena. Fascinating. Thank you very much.